Afghanistan, engagement and withdrawal, and American miscalculation. Am I being presumptuous to say that the whole world gazed in horror as pictures flashed across our collective TV screens to reveal the chaos at Kabul airport as frantic hordes of people clamored for escape? It was almost like a sci-fi movie of the hunted in the fight for their lives. As I continue to watch the daily unfolding of the debacle at Kabul, my mind flashed back to a similar, decades earlier scramble to leave Saigon. What was clear was that Afghanistan had fallen to the Taliban and people were fearing for their lives. Two countries, parallel histories, Afghanistan and Vietnam, and an American miscalculation. The apparent miscalculation was evidenced decades earlier when 2 days after American withdrawal from Saigon, South Vietnam fell to its nemesis, the Communist North. That was April 30th, 1975. Now it's August 2021, and 2 weeks after American withdrawal, Afghanistan fell to the Taliban. History was repeating itself right before our eyes. Attempts to establish a pro-American government under President Ashraf Ghani, as was previously done with Ngo Dinh Diem in Vietnam, failed. In both cases, the US spoke loudly, utilizing tremendous firepower, but in each instance, the nemesis waited and plotted and witnessed American withdrawal. Perhaps major miscalculations occurred because America really did not and really could not understand the country of its prolonged presence. The scales were therefore weighted in favor of the Taliban. For the Taliban, like the Viet Cong before them, knew their terrain and their people, and therefore which buttons to press. And so, like their predecessors, the Viet Cong, the Taliban snaked its way into various provinces and strategically waited and bided its time for Americans to tire and leave. Was this the only reason why the Taliban prevailed? I will say no. You see, in the hands of America's rivals, the American media becomes a tool to monitor American sentiments to compromise American efforts across the world. For their part, the Taliban leveraged information credits so acquired to enhance its speculative capacity to strategically plan for America's frustration and thus fuel its departure. Having discerned signs that Americans were weary of the war and did not want to continue, the Taliban, like communist Vietnam before, regrouped and waited for the opportunity. Therefore, 2 weeks after American withdrawal, the Taliban saw their opportunity and quickly swooped down on Afghanistan while the cowardly leader fled. Didn't we learn from our earlier missteps in Vietnam? Sometime way earlier, some argued for withdrawal from Afghanistan as they felt the odds were stacked against America. Senior fellow of the Independent Institute Center on Peace and Liberty, Charles Pena, argued that because of tribal divisions, it was challenging to train an Afghan army to stand up to the Taliban. This proved to be true as the American trained army came in as America withdrew. America's trained and equipped Afghan troops was unable to bolster the Afghan government's ability to stand up against the Taliban. 20 years of investment went up in smoke as those same troops fell like a house of straw before the Taliban. Contu Pena had suggested a US victory of the Taliban would need more troops on the ground. So, after the Taliban-Trump deal when US boots on the ground in Afghanistan were reduced from 100,000 to 3,500, the writing was on the wall. It should be noted that the stage for a Taliban takeover was essentially set when Trump administration brokered a deal with the Taliban in the absence of the then current leader of Afghanistan. But in doing so, the Trump administration was in effect recognizing the Taliban as Afghanistan's true leaders. It was then just a matter of time. Wasn't this another miscalculation? This compounding the issue, the Biden administration, following up on the Trump-Taliban agreement, announced a withdrawal of all troops. Perhaps Biden was riding on his favorable rankings in the polls at the time. The sudden announcement of final withdrawal by the Biden administration was ill-timed and of unbelievable abruptness. This was an unbelievable blunder, for it gave the Afghan government little time to plan a defensive strategy. Also, that a well-thought-out exit strategy was not in place was evidenced by the panicky efforts to return troops to Kabul to airlift masses of the frightened. Many questions arise. How could this happen when American motives were so altruistic? Was the US too naive in its vision for Afghanistan? Sooner or later, America will have to realize that it can't fix the world. Only God the Father can. Fight why America entered the war in the first place. America was fighting to redeem the American honor tarnished on 9/11 when terrorists attacked the World Trade Center in New York. We entered the war to oust the Taliban that at that time were hosts to the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, which later morphed into ISIS. But what was really achieved after 20 years? On the debit side, $2.15 trillion American dollars was spent and 2,315 American lives lost, along with 43,000 Afghan lives, according to American Magazine of February 2020. Time proved the initial success of ousting the Taliban to be temporary and the truce fragile, as the Taliban threat was always one step behind. And now, with the war ending in an American withdrawal and the Taliban entrenched once more in power, the gains seem dubious. After a war so ardently fought, there must be some gains. Using the measure of intent versus performance, we could ascertain the same. Firstly, I must say, it is demoralizing to see the Taliban back in power, and on September 11th, we have to face the embarrassing truth that the Taliban's flag will again be flying in Afghanistan as it did before our military intervened 20 years ago. Moreover, America went to war to annihilate ISIS, yet 20 years of fighting culminated in a showdown between America and a reanimated Al-Qaeda ISIS, the very same group we entered Afghanistan to get rid of. Now, we ended where we began. We started with death and injury of Americans, and we ended with the death and injury of Americans as 13 barely 20-year-old American soldiers' body lay dead on the floor at Kabul airport, the results of an ISIS attack. It all for naught. If this tragedy of epic proportions is what we get for our efforts and good intentions in Afghanistan, we should acknowledge going to war in Afghanistan was an inaccurate decision. Representative Barbara Lee could now engage in an "I told you so" moment, as she was the only holdout when Congress voted 420 to 1 in favor of military intervention. Back then, she was all but tarred and feathered for her decision. With foresight, she advised then that America's pain was too fresh after 9/11 when the decision was made to conduct a military invasion into Afghanistan. But time has proven the wisdom of her words, as indications are a poor military strategy was proven to be an inaccurate response. Regrets are that we did not consider the advice of wise others whose views may have been in contrast with ours. After 20 years, American pain and embarrassment is renewed rather than assuaged. But America, all is not lost. The fact that Afghans reject the way of life offered by the incoming Taliban leaders can be gauged by the desperation of the crowds at the airport clamoring for flight and of others fighting to get there. What America offered, girls were educated and now have a voice, to the point that women are now protesting in Afghanistan, even in the wake of a Taliban takeover. Who could have foreseen that Afghan women would be so empowered as to launch a protest in the streets? Well, kudos to the American empowerment of women. This is a major American legacy that I hope will not be erased. America showed the kind of life that was possible, and the people of Afghanistan seem to gravitate towards that and not wanting to return to the dark ages. Legacy. Another American legacy is that in the final moments they brought attention to the Taliban in a way that holds the Taliban up to the mirror of the world. The burden of proof now lies with the Taliban to prove they are not the terrorists or barbarians they are condemned as being. All the world is now watching. The Taliban is now accountable to the whole world. Embarrassment over Afghanistan does not have to be total if we learn from it. Upon reflection, we have hopefully learned that peace can no longer be forced by military might. Circumstances mutate, configurations of strife and conflict mutate, and understanding that parameters of war has evolved away from mere military might is also something that we have hopefully learned. We have hopefully learned that employing troops and investing in a country does not convert that country to democracy. We have also learned, hopefully, that Afghanistan is not an American mini-me. You cannot make over another country in your own image. It is like an adult whose identity is already formed. One thing that arises is that we can no longer journey on with flawed assumptions. We need to have an accurate view of ourselves and the world, and of ourselves in the world. We need to engage in more nuanced evaluations to attain a more accurate sight of who we are and of ourselves in the world. In the end time, the battles are for sight and blindness. We must change the narrative. I am Ingrid Rizzolo, and it has been my talk. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and leave a comment for me, perhaps on what America's new role in the world should be. See you next time. Bye for now.